Thank you to the organizers for the invitation. It's a very interesting conference. One of the main innovations introduced by the Stoics was to affirm that the world is, according to an expression which became famous, the common city of gods and humans. All the other beings are subordinated to these two categories, since only gods and humans are rational beings. There is, however, a difference. Gods represent the perfect reason, while human beings, with a unique exception, the sage, are imperfect, rational individuals. The world that is himself God is a polis governed by the divine reason, which gathers the whole humankind, since all humans are rational, but only the sage shares the right reason with God, while others, the individuals with imperfect reason, are said to be exiled from the only true city. They don't know its law, the law of nature, the non-written only true law. They ignore its politeia. The problem of the articulation between the cosmic city and the little cities, artificial cities, is a very complex one. Perhaps can we say that these fragmentary cities are like imperfect reflections of the cosmic city. But anyway, for the Stoics, the categories generally considered as normal, like nations, cities, or the distinction between Greek and barbarians, have no essential reality. The only authentic reality is the structure of the concentric circles, like it has been described by Heracles, a Stoic of the first century. The principle, you have the text here, the principle is this one. Each one of us is, as it were, entirely encompassed by many circles, some smaller, others larger, the latter enclosing the former on the basis of their different and unequal disposition. The first circle encloses the body and anything taken for the sake of the body, for it is virtually the smallest circle and almost touches the center itself. To sum up, next comes the circle of the family, then the circle of the city, then that of the nation. The outermost and largest circle, which encompasses all the rest, is that of the whole human race. This system of circles explains the cultural and national difference, and at the same time, it aims to reduce them. Life creates distances between human beings, but in a reverse movement, ethics bring them closer to each other. It is incumbent on us, that's a quotation, to respect people from the third circle as if they were those from the second, and again to respect our other relatives as if they were those from the first circle. In other terms, the person you considered as a barbarian can become, thanks to your ethical strive, as close to you from a rational perspective as your parents are from a biological point of view. What was the Stoic interpretation of the concept of barbarian in such a context? My answer is much more a deduction from the general logic of the system than a conclusion based on evidences. For the Stoics, the logos, both speech and reason, has two aspects: the logos prophorikos, that who allows the communication, the uttered words, and the logos endiathetos, the inner language, that of the concept and of the ideas. Those who don't have a perfect reason focus their attention on the logos prophorikos. They stress on this criterion in order to create a difference between human beings, dividing Greeks from barbarians. But those who are sage, or at least close to the wisdom, know that pronunciation is only a superficial element on which it is impossible to build a real system of differentiation. The only legitimate criterion is the difference between the sage and those whose reason is feeble and or ill. So the concept of barbarian is not absolutely meaningless, and the Stoics themselves were very attentive to the barbarism and to the problem of the correction of the language, but the importance given between the difference between barbarian and Greeks as an essential criterion was in no manner legitimate. What was the concrete result of this attitude on Roman Stoicism? We must first notice that the concept is almost wholly absent of the huge corpus of Epictetus' work. We find only one reference in 3:9-14, where the philosopher himself is accused by his enemies of making solecisms and barbarisms. In Marcus Aurelius, we find one allusion to the verity of barbarian nation, 748-1, and in 931 he speaks about his life among barbarians. In Greek Stoicism, it seems to have been philosophically incorrect to mention barbarians. It is Seneca who, paradoxically, pays a special attention to the barbarians, both in his theater and his philosophical work. For him, barbarians have a specificity. In a very free manner, he adopts the concept of barbarian with a lot of nuances. One can summarize them by saying that for Seneca, as for Cicero, the main characteristic of these nations is to be unable to control their impulsions. Their reactions are immediate, as well in the wars as in the mornings. Seneca does not deny that barbarians share some common ethical notions with other nations, as for example the price of gratitude, at least in theory. But at the same time, barbarians become, in Seneca's reflection, the anthropological figure of a homme unable to obey the reason. Second point, to be a rationalist and an universalist sounds well and seems to express a great generosity. But there remains a difficulty. what about those who have another conception of universalism? In Judaism, there is both a universality of the origin, since all the human beings have the same ancestors, Adam and Eve, and a functional universality God gave to the people of Israel the mission of being the priest of the nations which must act, at least in theory, in order to become an ethic example for all the nations. One could have expected Stoics to interpret Judaism as a wrong kind of universalism, since Jews had at least an intuition of what universalism was and were, from this point of view, different of other nations. That was not the case. Jews were never perceived by Stoics as another kind of universalist. At the contrary, they accused them of superstition and of hatred of the mankind, misanthropia. In other terms, for the Stoics, the Jews became that ultimate other that they had almost expelled from the Greek culture by avoiding the term and the concept of barbarian. Posidonius was one of the greatest Stoic philosophers, especially in the Roman area, a very acute and creative man, but he used his prestige in spreading deceitful fables about the Jews that he considered as a nation of sorcerers. He accused them of such absurd things as to worship the head of a donkey and to practice the ritual murder as symbol of their hostility towards Greek and mankind. At the time of Caligula and Claudius, Chaeremon, both an Egyptian and a Stoic, adopted a Manetho's caricature of the Exode, presenting the Jews as a contaminated population expelled from Egypt. And Seneca has no kind of sympathy for what he calls this accursed race, about which he says they are now received throughout all the world. The vanquished have given laws to their victors, and he scorned at many Jewish traditions like Shabbat, circumcision, and so on. We can notice, however, that he recognized that Jews, I quote, are aware of the origin and meaning of their rights, while he says the greater part of the people, Roman people of course, go through a ritual without knowing why they do so. The conclusion, at least temporarily, of the confrontation between two kinds of universalism was given by St. Paul, about whom it can be said that he was both Jewish and Stoic, or neither Jewish nor Stoic. When he says there is no more Jew nor Greek, he recognized that the main division was no more barbarian Greek, but Greek Jews. And it is thanks to the concept of an embodied God that he tries to resolve the contradiction between horizontal and vertical universality. But we owe, if we can say, to Stoics the foundation of an universalist anti-Judaism different in its principle from the identitary anti-Judaism that preceded the Stoicism, and all this on the ruins of the concept of barbarians. How many minutes? Thank you. Now, Rome. Et si tu peux, voilà. Oui. Voilà.
Je la fais plus petite ou vous voulez défiler
Non, si vous pouvez le faire plus petit. Voilà, très bien. Très bien. Well, just some remarks. Stoicism played a great role in the ideological construction of the Roman Empire. But what about the integration of the concept, the word, in the Roman language and philosophy? First, about barbarians, the comparison between Cicero and the Epicurean poet Lucretius is interesting. In Lucretius, almost no mention of this anthropological reality. At the contrary, Cicero, in his first book, the De Inventione, defines the identity problem still by the alternative Graius and Barbarus, no mention of the Roman identity. In 103, in a rhetorical description, barbarians appear as a vestige of the original bestiality, especially when Cicero evokes a crime about which he says, and this is the text, that is unknown even among savage, barbarous tribes and wild beasts. The progression is interesting. First, individual savagery, then the collective bestiality, represented by some nations, the barbarians, at the summit, if we can say, the beasts themselves as the absolute opposite of humanity. Two elements are said to be in the first Cicero speeches constitutive of the barbarian identity. The first one is to be guided only by desire, as you can see in text number 2. The second element of the barbarian ethos, an evident consequence of the first, is to be unable to build projects. They live in the present and only in the present. That means that they lack the most important political quality, prudentia, the meaning of which is to look far into the future. The opposition of these two attitudes is to be found in a rhetorical topos of the De Oratore text number 3. It is necessary not to forget that Roman thinkers had to face the affirmation that they were themselves barbarians. This appears clearly in De Republica 158, text number 4. Number 4. When Scipio asks Laelius if Romulus reigned over barbarians and got these answers, if, like Greek says, one must be a Greek or a barbarian, I fear that he had reigned over barbarians. But if this name must be given to customs, not to word, in my opinion, Greeks are not less barbarians than Romans. This helps to understand the plasticity of the concept of barbarian in Cicero. It is not a fixed anthropological category, but a kind of ethical evaluation of a nation, or better, a mix of anthropological category and ethical evaluation that can vary with the situations and the rhetorical context. For example, in some texts, he says that Persians are horrible barbarians, and in other texts, they are admirable people. At the moment of his life, let us say in the 50s, Cicero realized that he was unable by himself to prevent the regression to the primitive state of violence he described for the first time in De Inventione. There was a solution to admit the presence of a magnus ac sapiens vir who could be Caesar, but this was not, could not be accepted by Cicero. For him, philosophy had to give an answer to these questions. Are really violence and egoism the primitive state of mankind? If it is not, can it be said that at the fundament of human societies there is a natural law, not of violence like the one defended by Callicles in the Gorgias, but of a universal rationality? To summarize, in the De Republica, Cicero tries to go further and to give some affirmations valid both for Greek, Roman, and barbarians. There can be different sorts of universalism. Universalism of the great man, a great man contributing to the construction of a state, and that is true for Greek, Roman, and barbarian. Second form of universality, that of desire and egoism. Philus, in the famous anthology of the book 3, says that law has no other origin than egoism, and this is true also for Greek, Roman, and barbarians. And the third one, the third possibility of universality is that we find in the speech of Laelius, where the universality of reason has replaced the universality of desire. The lex naturae presents in this text the particularity of being inherent to the world. It is the universal logos in his function of saying what must be done and to forbid what must be avoided. And this is true also for Greek, Roman, and barbarians. The result of the Ciceronian reflection is clear. From a philosophical point of view, all the laws are in their principle equivalent. There is no fundamental difference between Greek, Roman, and barbarian laws, since they are all inspired by egoism, or there are the forms, imperfect forms of the law of nature. There is an exception for Rome. It's true in the De Legibus. To conclude, it was not easy to build an ideology of domination by giving it a philosophical fundament. Cicero's efforts were sometimes confused by had, as a result, the fact that the relation of Rome to other countries was thought on basis very different from the traditional Greek barbarians division and even from the Greek barbarians Roman tripartition. At the beginning of his reflection, Cicero was not interested on what could be exactly barbarian laws. The introduction of the concept of lex naturae, the definition of a special function for Rome in the history of nations, and the idea that Roman domination will bring benefits to all kinds of countries represent the definition of a new vision of humanity that Augustus will embody in his very peculiar way. In a more general way, the Roman and Stoic experience confirmed the incredible plasticity of the concept of barbarian and its capacity not to be an obstacle for the expression of new ideas. Thank you.